Good evening. My name's Andrew Petter, president of Simon Fraser University, and let me begin by acknowledging the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples on whose unceded traditional territories we're privileged to gather. And thank you for being here. I do want to acknowledge that we actually have one politician in the room. Here to learn or to contribute, I don't know, but Adrian Dix, the MLA for Vancouver, Kingsway, and Minister of Health. And we have a lot of political junkies in the room of various descriptions and people from the media, and I won't try to acknowledge you all, but thank you for being here. It is a real pleasure to welcome you to SFU Vancouver for a book launch and a conversation around a matter of confidence, the inside story of the political battle for BC. Now, of course, SFU has branded itself as Canada's most community-engaged research university. And it is so because we host events like this. We really believe universities have a responsibility to provide a platform for discussion on important issues that matter to people. And clearly this is an issue that matters to people in British Columbia, as evidenced by the fabulous turnout we have and capacity crowd. And it should. Not only is the 2017 British Columbia election destined to be an important part of this province's political history, but the events that occurred immediately following the election have constitutional implications for British parliamentary systems everywhere. And I just can't resist saying, as a former constitutional law professor, that these events had me just pining to be back in the classroom. I can't tell you the number of times I tried to convince my students that the role of the lieutenant governor was actually important, and that the constitutional conventions were ones that they should attend to, and their eyes would glaze over or roll. And if only one could have been, or I could have been in the classroom in the aftermath of this election, the circumstances would have made the case for me, and the book that we're going to be hearing about tonight does a very nice job of laying out why the role of the lieutenant governor is as important as it is. And not only does it lay that case out, but in fact those events now become an important part of the constitutional narrative for future circumstances, not only here in BC, but in any British parliamentary system. This becomes part of the convention, part of the practice that others will look to in deciding what the role of governors general or lieutenant governors in parliamentary systems should be. So there can be little doubt as to the consequential nature of the 2017 BC election, constitutionally as well as politically, and of the value of this book, which also covers the political history of the past decade in setting the stage and providing the context for the story it tells. So I'd like to thank a few people. I'd like to thank Nancy Oweiler, the director of SFU School of Public Policy, and Janet Weber, the executive director of SFU Public Square, who teamed up to host this event. I'd like to thank Eva Lewis of the School of Public Policy and Landon Hoyt and others at SFU Public Square, many of whom you see out there with their t-shirts, who are helping to organize it and make sure that you're all seated comfortably. I'd also like to congratulate Rob Shaw and Richard Zussman for writing this book on top of their day jobs as reporters, and thank them for being here to share it with us tonight. Now, I'll leave it to Francis Bula to introduce Rob, but I feel compelled to say just a few words about Richard, because I've known Richard since he was, let us say, very, very young. And I assume everyone knows, or you wouldn't be here, what a great political reporter he is, but you may not know that he once aspired to become a sports broadcaster in the mold of the legendary Bob Costas or Mike Tirico. And indeed, having studied political science at Queen's University, Richard went on to complete a master's degree in broadcast journalism at Costas and Tirico's alma mater, Syracuse University, where he covered the Binghamton junior hockey team. As a journalist, he quickly shifted from sports to politics, but I want to suggest that shift is not all that irregular here in BC. As I recall, Vaughn Palmer was a rock music critic before he became a political columnist. Mike Smith's not-so-secret passion is impersonating Don Cherry. Moreover, some might say that BC's most popular contact sport is politics, particularly given how the Canucks and the Lions have fared this year. But what's clear is that a background in sports broadcasting is no impediment, and some might say is an asset to providing some compelling play-by-play coverage of BC politics. And you're going to hear more about that tonight. And you're going to hear about it with the help of a wonderful moderator, also known to many of you, and a great journalist, Francis Beulah. Frances is an award-winning journalist. She's covered urban issues and city politics in Metro Vancouver for over 2 decades. She's reported on a broad range of subjects, including drug policy, bike lanes, billion-dollar developments, homelessness, elections. In fact, she's got a big quote in the book, too, on Gordon Campbell, so if you haven't read it, look for it. Frances was a reporter at the Vancouver Sun for 21 years, writes often for the Globe and Mail. She's also heard frequently on radio and has contributed to numerous other publications. She's an adjunct professor at, UBC's School of Journalism? A former chair of the journalism department at Langara College, where she currently teaches a civic reporting class. And now we get to the important stuff. I hope I have the important stuff. I believe she also has an affiliation with SFU's Urban Studies program, and she has contributed much to the work of that program. And I believe, even more importantly, she's an alumna of Simon Fraser University. So please join with me in welcoming the wonderful Frances Beulah.
So I'm not sure which mic is on here, but I'll speak in this one for now. So welcome everyone to Political Junkies Anonymous. I see it's a full meeting, so it's going to take us a while to go around and everyone say their name and what they're doing to overcome their problem. Maybe that will happen in the audience questions. Anyway, I was really thrilled when I was asked to come and moderate this panel, just so I could sit and listen and get a chair after everything had been sold out already. So it's great to be here. I'm looking forward to asking questions of Rob and Richard, although I have asked the organizers if my questions can be fewer so that you all have a chance to ask more questions, because I think this is the 10% or the 1% of the political junkie elite crowd here in Vancouver, and I'm sure your questions are going to be better than mine. So I'm going to have Rob and Richard come up and take their places here. And just for those of you who don't know, I know they have little potted biographies, but they're not very informative. It just says, I worked here, I worked there. So actually, these two authors have brought together the two sides of Canada in a way. Rob was born in Nanaimo, he tells me, and did go to Ryerson to get his journalism degree, and then came back here and worked at a number of Vancouver Island papers and the Times Colonist, and eventually the Vancouver Sun, where he's been doing an amazing job. I think we all started noticing him right away as soon as he got there. And Richard is from Ottawa originally, and also went to school for journalism, but had some direct experience with politicians. Told me he worked for an MP in Toronto. And I think, I'm not sure about that. Maybe you can answer that when you get up here. But, the descriptions that you have of behind the scenes politics are very understanding in the book, and they're very nuanced. And, sometimes people who have only experienced politics from the outside don't get the nuances and the subtleties in the background. So I'm not sure if Richard's experience contributed to that, but it certainly made for great reading about the human stories that go behind the headlines. So I'm going to ask both of you to come up, and we'll start with questions and get going, so everyone can buy your book as soon as possible. Okay, so this mic is working as well, and your mics are working? Everybody's
so,
good?
yes.
Oh,
Yep.
yeah.
Hello.
Oh, excellent feedback. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to leave a lot of time for you, but I'm going to start off with one of the things when you read the book, or even excerpts available for free without having to pay on the internet, is that one of the surprises for you when you wrote this book was finding out things that you didn't know while the campaign was going on. So one of the surprises, for those who haven't read everything yet, is that the NDP kind of made up their...
Presidents are good for something.
The NDP kind of made up their policy on eliminating the bridge tolls on the fly, like just, oh yeah, let's do this, between one elevator floor and the next practically, although no elevators involved, if I'm correct. So I wanted to ask you, what else did you find out as you were writing the book? Find out about what had happened during the campaign that you didn't know while the campaign was going on, where you were like, oh wow, I had no idea, I wish I'd known that.
I'll go back a little bit before the campaign because I think it set everything up. But this meeting that John Horgan and David Eby had about a year before the election, where there was a lot of talk that David Eby had created a team where he was getting ready to become the leader if the party lost in 2017 and the polls were not looking good, and the thought was that David Eby was going to be the next leader of the NDP. And this was building and building, and word got into the premier's or into the leader's office that something needed to be done. And we heard from many people about this conversation that took place between the two of them, where John Horgan said to David Eby, if you think you can lead this party better than I can now, go ahead. And Horgan canvassed quite far and wide and asked others if they believed he wasn't the right guy for the job to replace him then. It would have been outstanding that like a year before an election of a major party to change the leader. And everybody said, John, you're the guy. They went with Horgan. Eby told him he wasn't interested in the job, and Horgan went on, and we document in the book this incredible change in him through that period leading up to the election, then through the election campaign, and then clearly now as he's governing, he's a much different person than he was when he was the leader of opposition.
Yeah, a lot of, as you say constantly in the book, Horgan whisperers who got him to modulate his personality. But just with the sort of the tension between David Eby and John Horgan that was sometimes alluded to, or there were hints of it, did it make it more understandable once you knew about that meeting, or did it help explain some things that had puzzled you about the dynamic between the two of them? Because David Eby was getting amazing headlines in Vancouver for, we have to do this about foreign investment and that about casinos, and Horgan was getting no coverage.
And I think one of the things, when Vancouver Magazine came out with their top 50 most powerful people, and Christy Clark was number 1, and I think David Eby was number 4, and John Horgan was number 18. It sent this incredible sign to Vancouver that this is maybe the guy, David Eby is. But, Horgan did an incredible job through, as you mentioned, the Whisperers and others, to build who he was as a leader of the opposition, and develop that through the campaign, through, that moment where Christy Clark reached over and grabbed his arm at the radio debate, and he reacted, and we describe in the book, he walked back into the holding room and he said, I screwed up. Like, I really screwed up. And
toning it down for a book that has more F-bombs than any other political book. He only said screwed it up. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so I fucked up is what he said. And
that's what I thought.
and they looked at him, and that was sort of, I see that as a pivotal moment for Horgan, and how he realized that this was his chance. He never wanted to be premier. He never really wanted to be the leader. And at that point, he realized he had this opportunity, and he seized it. And he truly is a much different person that we see him today than he was then.
Yeah. And I'm taking inspiration from this as I cover the Vancouver civic election, where no one seems to want to be mayor. So I'm thinking
somebody has to win.
I'm thinking that's the new strategy. I don't really want to be mayor. If anyone else comes along, they can do it. But since I'm here, okay, whatever. And then you win.
Right.
Okay. So my second question, which is related to the first one, and by the way, I didn't properly explain, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, it does start off with sort of the dying days of Gordon Campbell's premiership, as sort of this sets the stage for all this drama that then happens. It's quite thorough in describing sort of how that all fell apart. Christy Clark's, victory, getting the leadership, and then leading the province and winning the first election. So you cover a lot, not just the election campaign, but out of all of that, was there something that you as reporters, it was a bit of a black box or a mystery, and you never could solve it, even when you went reporting, asking questions afterwards for the book?
It was challenging going back and looking at what we called sort of the mutineers who lined up to bring Gordon Campbell down in his final days, who tried to get Christy Clark out after she became leader in 2011. The 401 Club, as they were called, the 801 Club that were waiting right until the election night to get rid of Christy Clark. There was this kind of shadowy movement of people, and we canvassed pretty wide to try. We would have liked to have published a list, and everybody denied it. When
you did have some names.
We had some names.
I was surprised because I actually wrote the story for the Globe saying there was a group, but I didn't have any names.
It was, it's funny going back. People don't really like to admit some of the things that they might have been doing, and you ask them, and on the Gordon Campbell example, we were talking to people who said, I was on a conference call with the other mutineers, and we were all plotting what to do. And then you talk to the people, and were you on the conference call? Oh, no, I didn't. What conference call are you talking about? There was a letter that was circulating around. Everyone was trying to sign a letter to force Campbell out, and depending on who you talked to, it didn't exist or it did exist, and it was in a different space-time continuum. So I would have liked to have published more names, and I think in the case of Christy Clark, the people who bet against her in 2013 quickly made sure they were never associated with that again. And I wish we had got a bit more into that. But the longer, and that's why one of the reasons we did the book now, I think, is because the longer you wait, the harder it is to go back and really talk to people. They start to reinvent history a little bit and tweak it, and we caught them at this awkward, raw moment right after the election where there's a lot of emotions involved, and there's pros and cons to that. Some people probably maybe didn't want to talk to us at that exact moment, but I think they might have been a little bit more honest than a year from now or 2 years from now. It gets fuzzy. People remember it the way they wish it was rather than what it was. So we, it was a bit of a balancing act in the way we did it.
Yeah, well, and I don't think that was a black box. I think you actually uncovered more about who was in on those plots than any other account.
We could have spent a lot of time on it, and
I know.
we just,
I noticed you just glossed over certain things. Ken Bossencool, here gone. Nothing more.
And that is there's been some reporting about that, and that is another one of those things where there's a lot of questions still that linger about his departure from the Premier's office. So I think we served that story as best we could.
And we only had. So we did 70 interviews and wrote the book in 8 weeks, and we finished it at the start of basically the end of September.
So how many words per day is that?
And the craziest part of it,
on the first draft or the second draft.
We submitted too much. So like every daily story we've ever done, we panicked. There's no way we can ever hit this deadline, and then we gathered all this stuff. And then we had too much. We had to cut a whole chapter on the recount. So we had to cut our losses. We got to the point at 8 weeks where we've done the best we can. This is the deadline we have. We've got what we need. And some black boxes we couldn't open. Some things were just, the time required would have been too much.
Right. Or it wasn't that relevant maybe to the story.
Interesting to us,
overall. Okay, I'm going to go more now to the actual politics of it. And this is, I think anyone who's read it, this is a book for people who love politics and want to know how it works on the inside. It's not a book about how people in Prince George feel about, $10 a day daycare or anything like that, other than in the biggest terms. So that's the great thing about it. It has all these backroom scenes with the F-bomb, with people really laying it out. It reminded me a little bit of the British movie In the Loop, if anyone's seen that, where it's all about politicians and their communications people, and the politicians are all regarded as basically stupid animals who have to be kept in cages.
And there's no
we didn't get that impression.
People here, Francis, that work for
I know, and they're probably going, yeah, that's about right. So what did you observe about the dynamic between communications people and the politicians? And how much do you think it changed between the 2013 and last year's election? I know that's a really big question to address, but people don't understand that dynamic between communications people and politicians.
We got some great communications people in the audience tonight on all sides of the issues. Some liberals over there and some NDP here, and it was interesting. When we talk about the election, I think one of the things that comes across in some of the examples we provide is Christy Clark is so good as a campaigner, but she made a few unforced errors going into the 2017 election, and the comms strategy wasn't able to get around that. For example, the Liberals, we don't remember this, but they put quite a bit of money into childcare and housing in the pre-election budget. Totally overshadowed by Christy Clark going out and accusing the NDP of hacking the Liberal website. And it ate up all the oxygen in the room. And no amount of comms work was able to. So she made a few missteps every now and again that I think left the comms people trying to get around. John Horgan.
But just to ask one detail about that, did her communication staff really change between the two elections? Because Mike MacDonald was involved in both, right?
Yeah, Ben Chin. Ben Chin was a huge part of that.
Yeah,
Katie
so was there
Merrifield.
something different about the comms staff, or was there something different maybe?
She had a very well-oiled comms machine,
Yeah.
and it ran on all cylinders. And she started to be the problem a few times, and it was difficult. I think she's such an asset, and she was so good, and then there was a few missteps that no one could get around. John Horgan, his comms team, his problem was he didn't listen to them for quite a long time. He has issues in the number of people he trusts to take advice from. It's a very small group. And for a long time, people were telling him, John, you don't need to go to war with the media. And he finally learned, we chronicle in there at one point where he learned that even if he doesn't like the question, it's still an opportunity to talk about what he wants to talk about. And it sounds simple, but it took him a long time to get to that point. And when he did, in the middle of the election, he kind of transformed into the John Horgan that we see now. And it was a remarkable thing to watch because not a lot of people thought he could pull that off, and he did. And so once he started listening to that good advice he was getting, he changed quite a bit.
Yeah, Richard, anything you want to add? I mean, I still wonder if there wasn't somebody in Christy's camp who was giving her maybe bad advice that was throwing her off or something. No?
I think and this is a good point, I think, to thank Christy Clark and allowing so many of her staff to speak to us. This book would not have been possible without that. So we approached a number of staff, and they all said, we have to ask the boss. And she said, sure, go ahead and speak to them. And without them, this book would not have been the book it is. And so I think that, as an aside, was an important part of the way this was put together. I
see that they did not convince you that I Am Linda was an NDP plot.
She's here. I'm worried Linda's here, and I was worried that the NDP sent her to heckle me.
Linda's right here.
So when you talk about communications,
but that's another unforced error.
That story. And so part of that, and we detail parts of this in the book, is that Clark was being told during that process, leave this alone. Like, apologize, move on from this. And I had conversations with Linda. And when you cover these things, at times you become part of the story. And with social media, it becomes more active than ever. And I remember communicating with two people from the Liberal campaign, telling them, Linda's not a plant, cut that out. Stop doing that.
I saw you on Twitter doing it.
Yeah, so I woke up the next morning and they were still doing it, and I tweeted about it, and then that went crazy. And it wasn't the interaction itself that became the story. It was the fact that the Liberals were saying that she was a plant when she wasn't. And when we interviewed Christy Clark, she still believes that Linda was sent there by the NDP.
I saw that. You end off this one section with saying, she goes all through it, what the mistake was, how a previous warmer or more responsive Christy Clark would have just engaged with Linda and talked to her.
She had the skills to do that.
But then you end it with, and she still believes that Linda was a plant. So, congratulations.
And I think people, they were trying to tell her not to do that. And it wasn't, again, it's not the issue itself. It took up, it's just that it sucked, like Rob said, the oxygen out of the air. It was a crucial week of the campaign, leading till the end of the campaign, and it shouldn't have been an issue. And it was what was the lead question in all the scrums, because she wasn't answering it truthfully. And story after story went on for 4 days.
And I know Clark doesn't feel like the coverage was fair in a way because it didn't represent what she was seeing on the campaign trail, which is true, because that she wasn't encountering that kind of direct confrontation in the campaign trail. But little things can become big things, and it touched more on what people's perception of Christy Clark. And that we have a whole chapter in the book on the issue of gender and the public's perception of Christy Clark, and how many glass ceilings that she broke, and how the trail that she blazed as a strong female leader in this province, and yet the difficulties she had in terms of popularity with female voters. And for some people, they just looked at Christy Clark and they had this visceral reaction, and they didn't give her any benefit of the doubt. And the I Am Linda incident was an example for some people just fed in to this perception they had.
Well,
about
that
her.
she was mean, or
Right.
or that they were, or all of the Liberals maybe were in a bunker mentality where they saw they were, getting a bit like the knight in Monty Python, like everyone's the enemy, but I'm going to win anyway, even though I have no arms or legs. So, yeah. Although they were still doing quite well.
Well, they won.
towards the
So
end.
they won the election.
Those
So
votes and they got the most seats.
That's so last century. Okay, so more on to politics, even more politics. I've heard a lot of theories for why they lost. Why the Liberals lost those south of the Fraser and suburban ridings that ended up being so key.
Sure.
It was Uber, it was the taxi drivers, it was the tolls, it was people sick of portables in the schools. I know that factually we can't get to what it was unless you interrogate every person who voted and they tell you the truth.
It could have been a combination of all those things, right?
But what's your sense of how the two parties see what happened there? How do you think they see it? Because that's going to govern what they do in the future.
I think tolls was a big, I think affordability, and Rob, you spoke earlier about how quickly that decision was made. When you look at the ridings in Maple Ridge and in Surrey, that no doubt pocketbook issues do well in elections. And when you can think how much money you're going to save by voting for the NDP, that makes a big difference. So I think tolls had an effect, especially in those Maple Ridge ridings, which people often don't think about. But because that was linked to the Golden Ears, that one had an impact as well. And ride sharing, there's a debate in the book about the significance of ride sharing. And I'm not so sure, in speaking to people for the book and our other work, that was that significant, but it clearly had played some sort of role and was integral in sort of the pre-election conversations that the Liberal cabinet was having.
Mm-hmm.
It was an interesting election because normally at the end, parties spend a lot of resources breaking it down and analyzing it. And it didn't happen this time because everyone scrambled to move on to the confidence votes and the negotiations, and so there wasn't really the post-mortem that was done immediately. We tried to get into a bit of that in the book, but the parties didn't. They're only sort of now, I think, getting their heads around what happened. And it was almost like there was two different elections. There was the Metro Vancouver election, and then there was the one in the rest of the province. And the great challenge for the NDP is that they exceeded their wildest dreams in Metro Vancouver, and they still didn't win. And their challenge going forward is they've got to appeal to the rest of the province. I don't know how much better they can do on Vancouver Island or in Metro Vancouver, and it was a very polarizing election that way. That the province kind of split in half, and the stuff we were talking about in Metro Vancouver. Part of Christy Clark's problem in her cabinet and in her caucus was she had powerful MLAs from rural BC who looked at issues like bridge tolling and said, well, why are we? Like Metro Vancouver already has a sweet deal on transit, and why are we helping them even more? And that tension kind of led to some hesitancy when it came to acting as decisively on some of those transit issues here. And then Clark's want to engage in several years of guerrilla warfare with the mayors on transit, which is a whole other issue. And it just kind of, it was difficult for them to get that more mainline campaign going.
They did sort of foster that urban-rural split. And I remember going to a private speech Mike DeYoung gave not that long before the election where people were asking him about the housing issue and the crisis, and he just kept saying, past Abbotsford, not a problem, and that was a mentality that was in there. So I'm only going to ask two more quick questions, and then it's up to you. So I hope the microphone elves are ready. Given what you have observed of the way that John Horgan and Andrew Weaver communicate, negotiate, interact, whatever you want to call it, and I know people reported, I hate being asked to predict the future, but I'm going to ask you anyway. How do you see this strange alliance, or whatever you would call it, playing out until the next election?
I think we are going to have an election in the fall of 2021, and I think that proportional representation will be defeated in a referendum.
Wow. That's very definitive. We'll hold you to that. Do you want to start taking bets? Anyone? Do you have a different prediction?
I know there's people out there who think, there's that rumor going around that, well, maybe it would be the NDP's advantage to call a snap election, engineer one now, under first past the post, try to get a majority. They're still kind of at the tail end of their honeymoon period, kick the Greens to the curb and govern the same way everyone's governed when they have a majority. I don't, I'm not sure I see that. They still haven't offered the rest of the province anything to pick up those seats. And they still haven't achieved affordability or $10 a day childcare, there's other big issues they're still just getting going on. So Andrew Weaver, it's fascinating to watch him because he's huffing and he's puffing, but he's not blowing anybody's house down. He's just getting all worked up, and I think
which I understand is his personality.
I think they're still stunned a bit that almost a year into the mandate, you have a NDP government that approved Site C and is now promoting an LNG industry with more tax breaks than the Liberals ever offered. And the Greens are kind of trying to reconcile because we outline in the book why they couldn't support the Liberals, this visceral part of the Green base that would not allow the Greens to go to the Liberals.
People physically throwing up.
And yet they've supported an NDP government that has done two of the things that they absolutely opposed. And they're having to swallow, their pride a bit in justifying how they can continue to support the government without bringing it down, because I don't think they want an election right now either.
So you don't think, in spite of the occasional threats we hear of, I'm out of here, that'll happen?
I think the big misconception about Weaver is all he cares about is this PR referendum. I think what he cares about most is the climate action strategy that's going to come out in this fall. And I think when he was negotiating around the table, the most important thing to him was climate. I think that's why he's so concerned about LNG and the emissions that come from it. But that's why he's in this position. That's why he got into politics, and that's why he wants to be in the driver's seat for these discussions. And so they're unfolding. We'll see this climate action plan in the fall, and he's having a significant part of that. And I think after that, at that point, it will be worth assessing where he goes next. But that is the most important thing to him, not this PR referendum.
Right. Okay, my last question.
Okay.
What kind of response have you had from people in the book, to the book?
I've been amazed with how positive the reaction has been. There's a lot of people in the book that are here tonight who we haven't seen yet. So I've been thinking a lot about...
they haven't thrown anything at us.
You'll find out.
Yeah. But it's just, the whole support of everybody has just been so incredible. Like through this whole process over the last few months of doing this, and then putting the book down and now having it in people's hands, and to be on the Globe and Mail bestsellers list as a national bestseller, a little book from British Columbia, is pretty incredible. And so it's just been, that support's been amazing. And I think, maybe people don't want to say bad things to Rob and I because they want us to say nice things about them. But
I've
Go on
never
Twitter
found that happens with reporters. I've never found anyone
right, Francis,
holds back.
exactly.
No, we haven't. The reception's been great. We haven't had anyone upset. I don't know if Clark and Horgan necessarily liked the book, but that wasn't really a goal of ours.
We didn't write it for them.
We just kind of figured if everyone was kind of upset about it, then we were on solid ground, because no one's ever really happy. I think the NDP maybe felt that we didn't bury Christy Clark, and that was never the point of this book at all. I think time needs to pass before you can have a serious examination of her premiership. We're only getting to that point with Gordon Campbell now.
Right.
Because you need to allow a little bit of time to pass. So we did not pass judgment on Christy Clark, and we that's not what the book is about. And then I'm sure that some NDPers would have preferred we didn't mention that John Horgan never really wanted to be premier. And so there's I think things, but if you're a real partisan, you'll find stuff you don't like in it anyways. And we wrote it very deliberately to not be a history textbook. This is hopefully going to engage the people who maybe got involved in politics during the HST, maybe got involved during the confidence vote, maybe just briefly got interested in it, and they want to read something that's fun. I hope it's fun to read, and it's not boring. And that was the goal in who we were aiming it for.
Well, I think it's exciting for all of us who write about politics to see how much interest there is. You know, like if 5 years ago you'd said, oh, someone's going to write a book about BC politics and it's going to be a bestseller, like they would have laughed all the way
Francis,
to the
they laughed at us 2 months ago. And a buddy of mine who now works in Ottawa kept saying, I bought your book, but I'm one of 4 people who's going to buy it. And so it's been pretty good.
And that was your mother, right?
Right. I think she bought all 4.
Okay, we're going to take questions from the audience. So if people want to put their hands up, I'll try to keep track, and I will direct the microphone people to questioners. So, oh, come on, you guys. Okay, Frank, over here. Can you?
I probably don't need a microphone.
But do it anyway.
Okay.
Just.
I've only just purchased the book, so I can't do things. So I'm asking you to reveal. Although people say BC politics is a contact sport, I think it's more of a blood sport. But even in the worst tragedies, there's always very funny bits. What's your funniest moment from this, whether it's in the book or not? Because there had to be some humor out there.
Yeah, there's lots. I laugh when I read back the book. I'm just trying to remember what parts I laugh at.
We amongst the media, one of our funniest moments, and we made sure to get it in the book, was this incredible epic scrum we had.
This is the best.
With Bill Bennett.
I have another one. Go.
And Bill Bennett was under Gordon Campbell, a cabinet minister who spoke his mind vociferously, got booted out of cabinet, and he convened this scrum at the legislature hallway, and he just went nuclear on Gordon Campbell. He just called him all these names in the book, and he went on and on for 45 minutes, and he just, everything, all these stories, and it was so incredible, and we put this in the book. It was so incredible that he told this story at one point about Gordon Campbell took him behind a barn and spit in his face. He was so mad at him one day, and there was this long pause, and the Canadian Press reporter said, "Was it gob or spray?" That's the kind of interview it was. It was just like we had so much time to ask so many questions, and he was so candid, and So
I know.
Those are the kind of stories that I know. Like I was Jonathan Fowley, who was my predecessor at the Sun. He was there too, and I remember thinking part of the reason to write the book is like we had these incredible stories, and sometimes people leave, and you think we got to capture that. We got to write them down before we forget, and it was satisfying to be able to put things like that in there that people like Jonathan and others would remember.
Well, as I said at the beginning, you have a real ear for the complexities behind the scene and show that it's not just politics. There's so much personality involved in everything.
And mine is this scrum that John Horgan did. So in the midst of this hacking scandal, he was supposed to come to Victoria to do a scrum, but the weather was so bad his flight was cancelled, so they came across on the ferry, and Sheena McConnell is his press secretary, and Horgan always drives. He never lets her drive the vehicle, but he had to do this call with us. And the snow was coming and the roads were icy, and Sheena was driving, and we were all in my old office, and the whole gallery was basically there listening to this phone call, and John was speaking about what was going on, and all of a sudden he goes, "Sheena, stop the car, Sheena!" And you can picture him yelling at her as he's worried she's going to drive the car off the road or hit somebody in the snowstorm. And then he would get going again, and then he would stop again, and "Sheena, stop the car, Sheena!" And so that was a late addition to the book, and I went back
I'm
and
surprised
found
you didn't lead
the
with that.
audio, and I re-listened to the scrum, and it was like, it's funny now as it was that day, and we're all sitting there, like, and he's talking about a serious thing, and it's a big story, and we just can't stop laughing about the fact that they could drive off the road.
Okay, but now I must point out their two funniest stories are about reporters in an enclosed space talking to politicians. Just want to point that out before we go any further. Okay, other questions? Here, this gentleman here in the second row.
Just, if you could just briefly touch on the issue about the constitutional issue that was mentioned by the president at the very beginning. It'd be interesting.
Yeah, it's a pretty incredible part of BC and Canadian history what unfolded. And I'll tell part of it, I'll let Rob, but I'll sort of go at the end, because one of the things that we discuss in the book is this idea. So Christy Clark had this long meeting with the Lieutenant Governor that wasn't so long, and then finally came out and didn't speak. And the real question that still exists is what would have happened to the Lieutenant Governor if Clark had actually come out and said, I resigned and I asked for an election. What would the Lieutenant Governor have done? And the way that our system works is that the Lieutenant Governor is to call on a party or parties that have enough to form a majority of the votes in the legislature, and that's what she did. But there are serious questions about whether there would have been a different decision if Clark had actually come out and told the public, I resigned, I asked for an election. And it's fascinating to think, this book's full of what ifs, and that's one of the greatest what ifs, because the Lieutenant Governor may have come to the same conclusion. She may have been forced to take a little bit longer to make that decision, but she very well could have taken the First Minister's advice. It's very rare in Canadian history. I think it's only happened, 6 or 7 times that a representative of the Crown has turned down a First Minister's advice, and that's exactly what happened here.
And if you ask Clark that question, though, she doesn't think that would have made any difference. She talked about going in to see the Lieutenant Governor and knowing instantly, and she's a great observer of people as a retail politician. She's fantastic at it. She took one look at the LG and knew she wasn't getting an election. The body language, the way she was formally introduced, she brought a letter that was 2 to 3 pages written by Mike de Jong and some other people about how the House wasn't workable, gave it to the Lieutenant Governor. Lieutenant Governor took it, put it aside, didn't even read it. Questions that she kept raising, the LG didn't respond. And so Clark knew in her mind that she wasn't getting that election call, and it didn't matter afterwards. The LG was watching her on a live stream come out of Government House, waiting to see what she said. And that is part of the question. I think it goes a little bit beyond. Had she said in the days leading up to the election, I'm going to ask for an election, instead of creating this 3rd, 4th option that she'd said, where I'm going to give advice if asked, but only if asked, and it's still the LG's call, but I'll say what I think. And it's like, well, no, that's not really how it works. And so that was one what if in the book. I think another interesting thing is that the most respected constitutional scholar in Canada, who's a professor at U of T, Peter Hogue, he got phoned by the LG's office to talk, missed the call.
Oh my God.
Phoned back, never connected with her. She never actually took his advice. Which there's a whole another series of questions on who did she really listen to. There's we've named some of the people in there.
Black
because
box.
we know she, it is, and we know she met with the Governor General at a meeting in Ottawa, which was significant. But yeah, that's another black box. It's
so
exactly who gave her advice and what advice did they give
So
her.
one tiny nuance I don't get, and maybe it's because I'm reading too fast or misremembered, but I thought that when Clark went in, she did ask for an election.
Yep.
She
Yes,
tried
she did.
to. So are you saying
But she had said long ago, but then when she came out, she didn't say she did that. She said the Lieutenant Governor retired for the evening, I'm going to go back to my office and wait. If she had actually come out and said what she did, and then what happened is she went back to her office, John Horgan was called, he came, he did his press conference as the Premier designate, and then Clark did a press conference back in the Rose Garden near her office saying, I asked for an election. So, but she didn't say it publicly when everybody was watching, when, I think almost every eyeball that was interested in politics in the province was watching, and she went out and said she's retired for the evening.
But it seems odd that a constitutional issue would be decided on what someone said in public after they left the Lieutenant Governor's office.
Well, the LG is supposed to, listen to the advice of her First Minister. There's only one First Minister at the time, and that was Christy Clark. And rejecting that advice is very rare. So she didn't tell us what the advice was until it was all over. And I guess the argument is, had she told us and been honest of what she was going to say, it might have pressured the LG to seriously consider. And as it was, we didn't know. She didn't have to justify it, and off she went. So I don't know if that argument, it's a what if, but at the end of the day, the common sense decision to call on John Horgan and the Greens, it seemed to pass the common sense test. And now I guess it's a precedent. We may deal more with.
May we hear from the Liberals in the audience on that? There was a question over here.
one of the joys, excuse me, one of the joys of technology is having the book downloaded the minute it's released. So I've had a chance to read it, and it's wonderful. Thank you.
Good, thank you.
Two of the things that surprised me in the book was that Weaver leaned towards the Liberals initially in terms of an alliance, which I hadn't realized. And secondly, that Horgan, our Premier, is actually more of a Brown and a Green party. So my question to you, which is a bit speculative, do you think there's going to be more LNG, Site C types of decisions in order to develop jobs and votes outside of the Lower Mainland?
I think so. I think we're seeing, we talk about, it's a good point, we talk about when John Horgan finally agreed to become leader, the type of NDP he wanted, which was a much better balance between jobs and the environment. And then he lost that balance leading up to the election, some might argue, much more on the environment side. And we're seeing him slowly getting back to that job side, Site C and LNG and some of the resource projects. I think he's stepping into the kind of government that he wants to run now that he's Premier. And so I do think it's an interesting point. We forget where John Horgan comes from. People surprised at his decisions don't remember that's where he wanted to go from the beginning. I think that's an interesting point. Yeah.
Okay. Did you want to add anything?
No, I think
Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
Confidence and supply agreement and the Secretariat. So what's your sense about how the Secretariat, the CASA agreement's affecting the operations of this Premier's office as compared to the office under Clark or Campbell?
Well, there wasn't a confidence in supply. It's a brand new thing, so none of us are really sure how it's working at all. It's kind of, I asked this question to Andrew Weaver the other day because he came out and started complaining about LNG, and I said, don't you have a confidence in supply secretariat? Did you not talk to the NDP about this? Did they not clue you in? Did you not negotiate it? And it was, oh yeah, we talked to them. And they didn't listen. And they came out and did it anyways, and now we're mad about it. And I was just like, well, what is the point?
His advice was to Rob to go read his own book.
Yeah, then Andrew Weaver said, you should read your own book. I'm pretty sure I read it. I don't know. And it's a great question because I don't really know how it's working. It only works to the extent the NDP are willing to listen to the negotiations. And we see a tendency so far on some big items for the NDP to just continue on. And I don't know if that's them calling the Greens bluff or just them exerting the kind of government that they want to have. They've offered a few concessions. $10 a day childcare is no longer $10 a day childcare, just affordable childcare. Will you get to $10? Hopefully one day, maybe what year, who knows? Because Andrew Weaver didn't like $10 a day. So there are some concessions, but that Secretariat someone's gonna have to write a book about that at some point because I don't see it really working in a spectacular way so far, but I could be wrong.
But they are having those conversations, and I think the big part we're going to have to watch is this climate action plan. Again, I come back to that. I think that is such a pivotal part of this for Andrew Weaver. He got into politics because he believed that Gordon Campbell was making bad decisions on carbon pricing and on his environmental initiatives to try to cut emissions. And the climate action plan is a way to change that. And I think we'll see how well the Secretariat works because that's going to be the most critical negotiation, I think, for Weaver and the Greens.
I'll take a couple more questions, and just a reminder that when we finish here, we don't kick you out of the room instantly. There are loads of books for people to buy over there, and there's a lineup, and Rob and Richard will be circulating, answering all your questions, your secret questions that you don't want to bellow out in front of the whole crowd. So just a reminder about that. But any more questions here? There and there, unless I'm missing anyone over. Okay, why don't we do you in the third row, and then there's someone over in the back there, and then you, okay? Can you remember? And sorry for pointing and calling you. But I don't know everyone here.
Hi, it's me. I was wondering if you could comment on the dynamics going on the right side of the spectrum politically in BC. I mean, it's hard to ignore a lot of signals going on in the rest of Canada, Jason Kennedy, Doug Ford, whatever's going on in Saskatchewan and further. And so a couple thoughts or questions. is the Liberal Party going to amplify those spirits, or is it going to serve as a force to moderate them? And just more generally, what do you think about those revanchist, reactionary politics coming back?
I found it really interesting that we just went through a Liberal leadership and we didn't see any of these extreme policies, populist sort of style politics like Doug Ford, that we didn't see any of that in the Liberal leadership. And I think that says something about what's happening in the center right wing of the party, is that they can have debates around issues that don't lead to this sort of extreme politics that we're seeing down south in a sense, but more importantly to the two examples you referenced in Kenny and Ford. And so I don't know, one of the theories around proportional representation is that will lead to some extreme parties potentially on the right or the left that will be very specific and could create niche, and there could be a number of MLAs elected from those groups. We'll have to obviously wait to see what the PR system is and how that all works. But I thought it was fascinating that we didn't see any of those sort of candidates emerge in the last Liberal leadership.
Yeah, the Liberals are a free enterprise coalition that, I think they unite around center-right fiscal values, but we don't hear a lot of the center-right social values. You're not hearing a lot of I think the coalition moderates the social part of the spectrum. We don't hear a lot of talk about anti-abortion or opposing, LGBTQ rights or anything like that. It's not, the Liberals keep that down.
And there are voices.
And there are voices in the caucus who believe those things, but the party moderates the social side of the coalition. And it'll be interesting to see under PR if the party does split along that line, and then, the Liberals need to bring that element back in. Do they have to offer concessions and put that more into the party platform? I don't know. The other interesting part of the right spectrum is that Christy Clark fought in the 2013 election against what she thought was the conservative threat, the BC Conservatives, the right wing, and she defeated them. And then this tiny little echo of the Conservatives blipped back in 2017, and you could argue cost them the election.
Right,
and Courtney Comox, this Conservative candidate, appeared and sucked away a ton of votes, and everyone was like, what? and that riding was lost to the Liberals. And it's fascinating to think of that they stopped maybe looking to the right flank and defending that a bit, and it just caught them in the tail end, which I know some of them are kind of ticked off about.
There was a question at the back over there. Oh,
Hello.
Brayden. Hi.
Hey, Brayden.
I couldn't resist asking journalists a question. I'm going to pick up the book tonight, but I was curious because of how the BC election for once took over the whole national coverage for that night last May, what it was like on the press side of it to not have a result and suddenly extend scenarios into programming hours that you probably hadn't planned for, and to get all that out to the country that was suddenly interested in what was happening in British Columbia.
That was a rush.
Yeah,
that was a rush. Editor-in-chief Harold Monroe over there, I remember sitting at the paper trying to figure out what we were going to do. Thank God we came up with a great headline for the province: "Split happens," and that pretty much nobody read the story after they saw the headline. They were like, "Oh yeah, it's really good." So because the story was like, "We don't know what just happened. It's deadline time." It was like the headline was good. So we prepared, for the possibility. I wrote a series of boilerplate stories, one of which was Too Close to Call and Minority and Craziness, and I'm glad we did, because that was a real confusing rush on election night, and it probably took 10 years off my life in stress.
One of the things you do in television on election night is you run simulations, and you do every single scenario. So we had done this exact scenario in a rehearsal, and so you get the feeling for what it's going to be like, except the scenario runs for 45 minutes, not 5.5 hours, which is what election night was. But it was the most exciting time you could possibly have as a television journalist. I was doing results, and they were coming, and the ridings to be decided were becoming fewer and fewer, and we were trying to figure out how close it's going to be and if any of those could flip. And then you have Courtney Comox that finished 9 votes apart. Like, it was really an incredible, remarkable night.
Mm-hmm. which is why the book is so popular. I think a lot of people are still kind of high on what happened that night. Yes, go ahead.
One thing I was really impressed with when I read the book was the level of detail in the stories. I still recall when Christy Clark made toast when she came home because Hamish was hungry. I sort of thought that's extreme detail. And so when I was reading the Gordon Campbell section, I was kind of questioning, and this is where I want your take, did it matter that he didn't contribute based on the scenarios of the people around him?
Yeah, it would have been nice, that's for sure. There's always speculation that Campbell is working on his own book, and it's just a matter of timing. Now would be the time for him to do it, I guess. He's been gone long enough that he can get that out. I'm glad we got what we did from Christy Clark, and we need to thank her a lot for her participation. It was a difficult experience for her to talk to us so soon afterwards, and she gave us a lot of detail. And we tried to paint human pictures of people and weird little details like that. I'm glad you mentioned it because it catches in people's mind, that politicians are people, and that we hammer away at them, in these advertisements on TV that vilify them depending on which party you're in, and the coverage against them makes them seem like robots, and if you don't believe in them, they must be evil. They're just people, and they're trying to do their best, and we tried to get that across with the staff too, that the staff are often, they're fantastic people too, and they're caught up in this whirlwind as well. And so, yeah, we deliberately tried to put in little details like that. If we could have got some from Campbell, we might have humanized him a bit too, but I don't think it didn't work out that way. So
It was fun.
Okay.
Rob mentioned earlier, just quickly, that that there is this group out there, mainly of women who hate Christy Clark, and we hear about them a lot. And our editor considered herself one of those people. And we asked her when the book was done what she thought about the tone, and she said what shocked her about the book is she came out of it liking Christy Clark. And I think no matter what you think of her or her politics, I think the book hopefully gives you an understanding of who she was as a human being. I think one of the greatest challenges for Rob and I in our day-to-day jobs was understanding who Christy Clark is. And she is truly, I think, a political enigma. And I hope the book gives some sort of entry into who she is as a person and what she was trying to accomplish as Premier of the province.
Great. I'm going to take one last question from this gentleman in the front.
Just a question around something you've already alluded to, and that's the split between the province even during the election. Yeah. And part of what I see is that the interior is resource development, and I know I have a lot of family and people up north, and we very much split over urban-rural mentality, and that I see that the people in the resource industry refuse to look at climate as being an issue, whereas down in the more urban areas, climate is a big issue for however reason that's split. Obviously, more jobs are in that resource industry up north. How does that get resolved?
We're lucky in a sense, we live in a democracy, that every region in this province is represented by MLAs who come with the values of their constituents. And we're lucky we live in a province, I think, that has differing opinions throughout the province. And we have a premier now who has a cabinet that has some representation in rural British Columbia, but predominantly in Metro Vancouver. And those voices, in a sense, need to be amplified for those communities, because he is now governing for all of British Columbia. So they have those discussions around the cabinet table, and they make decisions on what they believe is best for the province. Horgan's spending time this week in the interior. He was criticized widely during the campaign for not doing that. So he is attempting to go and listen. And these events that they go to aren't all about media availabilities, which is the part that we see and that you see, but they're meeting with mayors, community leaders, industry, and trying to get an understanding of what matters to them in those communities, and then come back to Victoria and start making those decisions. So we'll see what sort of ideas come to the table. He was up in the northwest of the province, Horgan was last week, and so we'll see what sort of ideas come out of that visit that he had.
Did you want to add anything?
No, it's just that John Horgan said that's really the great challenge of his premiership. I mean, he's a legitimate hard hat wearing, Forest Mill working kind of guy, and he intended to be premier of a government that found a better solution to that question. that could reconcile this growing divide between, the environmental concerns, especially in the Lower Mainland, and the jobs and the power and the economy and the, using our natural resources in the rest of the province, and how it continues to drift apart. And I think he'll view his premiership with regret if he can't get to that. It was a core fundamental reason for becoming leader of the NDP. And, I'm not sure what he's going to do about it, but it's a top goal in his mind. So he's certainly aware of it, yeah.
And if he can do it, I mean, it's not just in BC that there's an urban-rural split. It's been well documented by political scientists that there's a growing divide in the States, in many provinces in Europe, and people aren't quite sure how to bridge it. Okay, I am going to close off now, and I'm going to invite Maureen Maloney. Yes? No? Who's coming up? What? Andrew. Okay, I'm inviting Andrew back up. So hold your applause until he tells you to.
I just really want to just close this off by saying very few things. One is, if I look a little tired, it's because I'm up to 2 in the morning reading the book. It's a great read, and I couldn't possibly stay up to 2 in the morning unless it was a great read. In the fine tradition of, I'm going to date myself now, but Teddy White's Making of the President series. And as we've heard, one of the really fine things I think about it is it treats the humans in the story as humans. It is humanizing. And politics, I must say this as a recovering politician myself, it is a human struggle. And it's important to recognize it as such, so the contest that is being played out is about the ideas and about the policies, because that's the site of democracy. This is where democracy takes place. And if it's all about who's up, who's down, horse races and individuals and their contests, we lose sight of the important things, which is the choices we make through this process. So although it's a great read, although it's entertaining, and although the personalities are played here, they're treated as human beings who are disagreeing over ideas and are struggling to try to make their case as best they can. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And it's wonderful for British Columbia to have the opportunity of journalists who are prepared to provide this kind of narrative. So on behalf of everyone here, I want to thank Richard and Rob for having written the book. I get no share of the royalties, but I want to encourage you all to buy the book. I think it is the SFU bookstore that's actually selling the book, so that's good news. And I particularly want to thank the wonderful Frances Beulah for humanizing this occasion and illuminating this interview so that we could enjoy and participate and learn more about the book. And if you haven't read it yet, just enough so hopefully you want to go out and buy it now and read more. So thank you very much, Frances.
Thanks, Andrew.
And finally, thank you for coming out and showing that you're interested in BC politics, in public, in the public discussion and debate that takes place. By being here, I think you've really sent a very powerful message that BC is a province in which our political life is alive and well, and thank God it is. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much.